In this chapter, we're going to be looking at human resource management, which is defined as the set of organizational activities directed at attracting, developing, and maintaining an effective workforce. I like to remember it with attract, train, and retain. Human resources has become a strategic issue as more and more firms realize how important their people are to the success of their business. It's also really important to note that hiring and training employees is both time-consuming and expensive. You want to hire the right person for each position so that you don't have a lot of turnover. If you spend a lot of time hiring someone and they don't work out, you're going to go through that process again. It can be very expensive, time-consuming, and wasteful. So planning for our HR needs is now part of the strategic planning process. We start this chapter by looking at the legal environment of human resource management. Human resources is governed by a country's laws and regulations. These laws and regulations are meant to reduce employment discrimination, to reduce unfair practices in the workforce, but they also have the effect of limiting management's discretion in human resource decisions. This means you can't do whatever you want when you're hiring, promoting, and firing people. You need to make sure everything you do is in accordance with the law. As you can imagine, this is an extremely important aspect of human resource management, knowing and following the laws. So now let's look at different categories of legislation. We'll start with equal employment opportunity. One thing I want to point out is that laws reflect what's going on in society. You'll see some of the dates on these and try and think about what would have been going on in society during this time frame. So laws do reflect what's going on at the time they are enacted. Let's start with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was enacted during the civil rights movement of the 60s. The intent of Title VII is to ensure that employment decisions are made on the basis of a person's qualifications rather than the basis of personal biases. It forbids discrimination on the basis of sex, race, color, religion, or national origin in all areas of the employment relationship. When we move down here to the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, that's actually an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is from 1978. So in the 70s, we had the women's movement, and this is a response to that. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act forbids discrimination against women in regards to pregnancy. The Age Discrimination Act was from 1967, and this forbid discrimination against anyone over age 40. And it's funny, when I think about this act, I think about my mother and what she looked like back when she was in her 40s. My mom actually had me when she was 41, and I remember walking around with her and people mistaking my mother for my grandmother, because back then, the big joke about, 40's the new 30. Well, 40 looked a lot older back in the 60s with horn-rimmed glasses and frosted wigs that were very popular. So this act was 1967, and it was protecting people over age 40 from being discriminated in getting a job because of their age. The Americans with Disabilities Act was 1990. This forbid discrimination on the basis of disabilities, but also required employers to provide reasonable accommodations for disabled employees. Lastly, on this list, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1991. This was another amendment to the original Civil Rights Act. This one made it easier to bring discrimination lawsuits, but also limited the amount of punitive damages that could be awarded in those lawsuits. We also have laws that regulate compensation and benefits. The Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938, which has been amended frequently since then, set the minimum wage standard and required the payment of overtime for work in excess of 40 hours. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 requires that men and women be paid the same amount for doing the same job. It's interesting to note that even today, we still don't have equity in pay between men and women. Women, on average, are paid only 80 cents for every dollar paid to men. It's important to note there are instances where men and women might not make the same amount of money for doing the same job, and that doesn't mean it's illegal. For instance, if a man has been in a position for a longer period of time and has seniority, then that's a perfectly legal reason why a man would be making more than a woman. Another would be performance. When people get salary increases at the end of the year, it's usually based on a performance review. So if someone is performing at a higher level than another person, they might make more money as well. Moving on to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, which is known as ERISA. The purpose of this act was to ensure that pension plans were financially secure, and it regulated how they could be invested. ERISA established the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp, known as PBGC. This is similar to the FDIC insurance that we have previously heard about. And what it did was it provided coverage in the event that a pension plan was terminated and didn't have sufficient funds to pay out benefits. Lastly, we have the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993, which is the FMLA. This is definitely legislation I want to make sure you understand and know. This act requires employers to provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave for employees so they can handle family and medical emergencies. You might ask yourself, why would I want 12 weeks of unpaid leave? I want to get paid. Well, this ensures that if you have to take time off of work, you have a job to come back to. If there was a family emergency, for instance, perhaps your mother was sick and needed to be cared for. You only have one mother and you might only have one opportunity to take care of your mother. You would want to take that time off and do what you could. But given our current environment where most families are two incomes, losing a job and not knowing if you have the prospects of getting a job when you needed one can be devastating. This guaranteed you would have a job. Now, I want to point out it doesn't guarantee you have the exact same job that you had before, but it would be at the same level and at the same pay rate. Now, this law is only required for businesses that have 50 or more employees, so it isn't burdensome to very small businesses. So I want to give you an example of what was going on during this time frame to make this such an important piece of legislation. And I'll use myself as an example. My mother had me when she was in her 40s. Now, this was in the late 60s. She was kind of a pioneer. There weren't too many people having children that late back then. But she was 41 when she had me, and I waited until I was almost 30 to have my first child. So when I gave birth to my first child, my mother was already in her 70s. That's very different from when my mother had her first child. My mom was in her 20s with her first child. Her mom was still really young at that point. So she didn't have small children and older parents to take care of at the same time. This is sometimes referred to as the sandwich generation, which is what I was in. I had a small child, a baby, and I had an elderly mother that needed help. So it became increasingly important to give people this opportunity to take time off if they needed it. Back when my mom had her youngest children, if she needed help, she had her mom there to help her. But I had to take care of both my children and my parents at that time. Now let's move on to labor relations. When we talk about labor relations, we're talking about unions. And what's interesting here is the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, gave unions power. It set up a procedure for employees to vote on whether to have a union, and if they did vote for a union, management was required to bargain collectively with the union. This legislation had the effect of building union power. As a result of that, over time, in 1947, the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947 was enacted to start to limit union power. Lastly, we're going to touch real quick on health and safety, and we only have one here to mention. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, also known as OSHA, directly mandates provisions for safe working conditions in your job. Your place of employment should be free from hazards that can cause death or serious physical harm. And that's what OSHA is meant to do. You might be familiar with OSHA if you work in a hospital or you work somewhere where it's might be dangerous. But it is in place at every place of employment. Now we're going to go through the major responsibilities for human resource management, and we're going to start with planning for staffing needs. We want to do a job analysis, which is a systematic analysis of the jobs within an organization. Once we understand the organization's jobs, its employees, and its environment, then we can plan for future HR needs. So it's important for us to look at external labor markets to see if there will be enough qualified employees for the jobs that we're going to need to fill. We need to understand our current employees. Do we have a lot of employees that are nearing retirement and will need to be replaced? Also, what do we want to do with our organization? Are we going to be growing or are we going to be contracting? That also factors into how many employees we need. And of course, the general economic trends will dictate the kind of employees and the number of employees we need to hire. So as part of our planning and our HR, we move to recruiting. Recruiting is about attracting people to want to work for our organization in the jobs that we have open. So it's about making our place of business or our organization attractive to people. If it's not an attractive place for people to apply to, we're not going to get a good pool of candidates. We can distinguish between internal and external recruiting. When we consider present employees for jobs, that would be internal recruiting. Internal recruiting is very good for building morale and helping us retain high-quality employees. No one wants to be in the same job for their entire career, and knowing that you work for a place that will move you up through the hierarchy or move you to different jobs can be very good for morale and retention. The disadvantage is what we call the ripple effect. If I promote someone from one department into another, now I have an opening in another department. And if I continue this internal recruiting and promotion, I'm going to find all these additional positions I need to fill. But I'm not saying that's a bad thing if it's good for morale. External recruiting is when we bring people in from outside the organization, when we recruit people from outside. External recruiting tends to be more expensive because of the effort that goes into posting in different places and bringing them in. One of the good things with internal recruiting is your employees already know the culture of your organization, so they already know so much, and you have a history of how they've performed in the past. At the bottom, we see a realistic job preview. This is considered a successful method to ensure that we have a good fit between the person we're hiring and the job they're going to be doing. So with a realistic job preview, the candidate might shadow or follow someone in the job that they're applying for to see what it really is like. And this is a good way for people to get a taste of a job, and you're not and then you don't end up hiring someone who has only been told a rosy picture of what this job is going to be, and they have an idea of what it will really be. Next, another responsibility for HR is selecting people that are going to be hired. These are 5 different devices used in the selection process. We have applications. These are generally used to gather information regarding your work history, your education, and other jobs you may have had. You can't ask for information that's not related to the actual job. You might have tests as a device used to select people. Tests can be of your ability, your skills specific to a job, your aptitude, which is your ability to learn, or your knowledge of something. Those kinds of tests are usually good predictors of job success, but the important thing is they need to be validated, administered, and scored consistently. Validation is extremely important. This determines the extent to which a selection device is really predictive of future job performance. Let me give you an example. If I were to say for a job that it was a sales job, so you're going to be selling something for my company, and I want to look at your SAT scores, and I determine that the people I want to hire for this are going to have the SAT scores in a certain range. Is that really predictive of how successful you'll be in a sales position? I would argue SAT scores aren't really predictive of how well you'll do in college either, but it certainly is not a good predictor for how you'll do in a sales position. What might be more appropriate might be some sort of personality test, because if you're in a sales position, your comfort in dealing with people and your level of extroversion might actually be appropriate. Interviews are a popular but sometimes poor predictor of job success. Interviewers sometimes have biases, but our validity for an interview can be improved by training our interviewers so that they are aware of any potential biases, and also using structured interviews. A structured interview means that we have a set of questions that we've developed before we start interviewing, and we use the same questions for every candidate. I've been on searches where if we missed a question with the first person, we didn't ask it for anyone else, because it would be an unfair advantage if someone were to answer that question in a great way, but someone never got the opportunity to answer that question. So structured interviews allow us to compare candidates because they were all asked the same questions, and we can really compare them appropriately. Assessment centers are another popular method for selecting managers and current employees for promotion. These typically involve 2 to 3 days of managerial exercises, and it lets us see these employees in action under different situations and circumstances and see how they perform. And there are also other techniques like physical exams, drug tests, and credit checks to screen prospective employees. The important thing is to understand the job you're trying to fill and what the best selection device will be to ensure we can narrow down our candidates to the right ones for the job. Training and development is another major area for human resources. The first step is to assess the training needs at your organization. Determining those needs is the first step in developing any kind of training plan. We see here common training methods, and depending on the kind of training that's needed, training or development, the method used should be appropriate for the type of thing being learned. If we're talking about factual things, you can do something like a lecture, which would be similar to a face-to-face class like you would have on a school campus. If we're talking more interpersonal things, having to talk with customers, then role play might be more appropriate. if we're learning something, think about a supermarket. You have a new cashier. You give them the basics of how to run the cash register and ring things up, but they might learn more on the job. Vestibule training is similar to on the job, except you're not actually doing the work in real time. So if you're working on manufacturing equipment, a vestibule training would be the setup for doing the work, but it wouldn't be part of, say, the assembly line. It would be separate, so you don't have the pressures of doing the work in the production process, but you can learn it separately. And then we have web and electronic training, which is also appropriate in certain circumstances. For instance, some HR training, like when we have our sexual harassment trainings, so that you can watch a video, have a description, and then answer questions. And this is convenient because employees can do it at their convenience. The nice thing about electronic and web-based, it is consistent. Like this video I'm putting together, everyone will watch the exact same video. And that's one of the benefits of online trainings. So you determine what we need to train and what would be the best way to do it. For instance, electronic training would not be appropriate for something like CPR, right? That would have to be in-person type of training. Another responsibility for human resource management is performance appraisal. This is the formal assessment of how employees are doing in their jobs. It should be done regularly. Most places do it yearly. Some places do it twice a year. And it's important because it validates the selection process and the effects of training. So we look at performance appraisal and we can see, if we have a new hire, how they're doing. Did we make the right selection for this position? If we've put people through training, is that training working? How are they doing in their jobs? It helps us also make decisions about pay raises, promotions, and if there's future needs for training. And it also provides necessary feedback to employees for them to improve their performance and also plan out where they might want to go in the future with our organization. As important as performance appraisal is, there can be errors in the process of doing performance appraisals. This is one of the behavioral aspects. Just like when we have decisions to make, we have to be aware of some of the biases we might have or the errors we might make. So let's talk about recency error. Recency error would be only thinking about those things that happened most recently, and this can skew a performance appraisal. So say you have someone who's an average performer all year long and then has an amazing sales month. And you write this person up as being this amazing employee when actually, when you look at 12 months worth of work, they're not as amazing as your appraisal is to be. That can also work in the other direction, where someone has had a very good year, but does something wrong in that last month before the performance appraisal, and their whole performance appraisal is tainted by something that happened recently. So we have to be very careful to judge the whole performance period. Next, we have errors of leniency and strictness. This is when we are overly lenient with someone because of some circumstance, or we're overly strict with someone because of some circumstance. Perhaps it's a family-run business, and the owner is evaluating a family member. It might go either way, right? They might be overly lenient in how they appraise them, or they might be even harder on them than they would be other employees. We can also have these errors of leniency and strictness for people that might be going through something and we're overly lenient with them. We want to try to be as objective as we can and avoid leniency and strictness. The last one is the halo error. You might have an average employee, or maybe they're not even a great employee. You know, they're not the best employee, but there's something about them that we like. So they're friendly, we like them as a person, and we let that one attribute kind of become a halo for their whole performance review. So just because we like them and they're funny and they're friendly, we rate them high on their actual quality of their performance. So these are some of the things we need to be very aware of as we're doing performance appraisals. When we do them, we want to try to have objective measures of performance whenever we can. So that would be actual output. So units produced, a scrap rate, a dollar volume of sales, the number of claims processed. These are things we can count. They are objective. We have to be very aware of opportunity bias. This is when one employee has a better chance of doing well in comparison to someone else. I like to give an example of a police officer writing tickets. We can have two police officers and one always hits their quota and the other one always comes up short. Well, it could be opportunity bias. Perhaps one police officer is sitting on a quiet road where there's not a lot of traffic. Well, there's less opportunity to give tickets. But the other one is sitting at the bottom of a hill around a blind curve. And that one writes the most tickets. We can see that it's not fair to compare them because their opportunity to write those tickets is different. The same thing can happen with a sales position. If someone has a region that has a high concentration of people wanting to buy our product, they're going to have higher numbers because their opportunity is better. So we need to be careful to look at those biases and make sure we aren't over-rewarding someone or punishing someone for not being able to hit the same quotas. If we have performance tests, that can also help us be objective. And then we have judgmental methods, such as a ranking or a rating, and we'll quickly look at both of those. But it's where we're comparing employees against each other or with each other, or comparing an employee with a fixed standard. So we'll look at graphic rating scales and the behaviorally anchored rating scales. Here's an example of a graphic rating scale, and as you'll see, we have 3 dimensions: punctuality, congeniality, and accuracy, and this is a graphic rating scale for a bank teller. So what we have is, as we're doing this evaluation, we have this sentence: this teller is always on time for work and promptly opens his or her window as scheduled. Well, we select. We strongly agree with this. This is how this person generally works. Then we would circle this. We would look at congeniality, circle the appropriate one, and accuracy. Typically with something like this, we would have an area underneath where comments could also be added. This is a behaviorally anchored scale. So we see we have 1 to 7 for this one, and this is about a specialty store owner and inventory control is what we're judging. We can see when we start down here, 1 would be never orders in the right quantities or at the right time, all the way up to always orders in the right quantities at the right time. So we have sentences describing behavior, and we would pick the right one for the employee. We're not done after we perform the performance appraisal. It's important to give feedback. It is best to give feedback in a private meeting between the employee and the immediate supervisor. It's also important to note here that HR coordinates this activity but doesn't actually do the performance appraisal because you don't work for them. They're not your supervisor. Your immediate supervisor is the one that would do the performance appraisal. And it's important to focus on the facts. You don't want emotion to come into this. You shouldn't say things like, I don't like the way you do this. It should be, you're doing this incorrectly, or this is the way it's supposed to be done. Make it factual and objective. It should not be personal. Discuss the assessed level of performance, how and why the assessment was made, and how employee performance can be improved. Typical performance appraisals are from your immediate supervisor, but a different way to do a performance appraisal is what's called a 360-degree feedback. This is a much richer array of performance information on which to base an appraisal because you're evaluated by the people around you. So you're evaluated not only by your superior, but also by your subordinates and your peers. So basically all the way around you, like a circle, 360 degrees. It's similar to how professors are evaluated. We're evaluated by our students, so that would be like our subordinates if we're comparing to another type of organization. We are evaluated by our peers. They sit in our classes, and then our deans or chairs also provide some feedback. So this is another way to do a performance appraisal. Is also concerned with compensation. So when we talk about compensation, we're talking about the money that we receive for the work we do for an organization. We can talk about it in terms of either wages, which is typically a per hour rate of pay, salary, which would be a yearly amount that is paid out based on how many pay periods there are in that year. And then we have other incentives like commissions, bonuses, or those kinds of things. The wage level decision has to be made by the organization. Does management want to pay at the same level as other firms in their industry? Do they want to pay above that, or do they want to pay below that? And they compare what the going rate is for labor in an industry. So a business would make that wage level decision, and if they wanted to attract more people, they might want to pay above what the going rate was. So what determines the level of compensation that an employee gets? There's actually quite a few things that determine that. Your skills, your experience, certainly has an impact on how much you're paid, but also where you're working, the type of job you have. You should be paid more if you're working in New York City versus working in New Jersey because the cost of living is higher. What you're paid also depends on what the organization can afford to pay you. If it is a well-known, well-established company, they're going to have more money and be able to pay a higher rate. If it's a startup, mom and pop, an entrepreneur, they might not have as much money on hand to pay a large salary. So there are lots of things that go into determining compensation. The next thing to talk about that HR is very involved in are benefits. Benefits are considered indirect compensation. So it's things of value other than the compensation you get for doing the work. The average company spends an amount equal to more than 1/3 of its cash payroll on employee benefits. So to make the numbers easy, if your salary is $100,000, you're actually costing the organization $130,000, okay, because benefits are that expensive. So a good benefit plan encourages employees to stay with the company, and it also is a good tool to attract new employees. They don't necessarily stimulate high performance, but it is a way to attract and keep people. So when we're managing those benefits, we have to determine what benefits are important to our employees. So it's a balancing act of shopping for the best cost providers, making sure we have the benefits our employees want, and make sure the coverage that we have is not redundant, so it's effective. Now let's talk briefly about labor relations. Labor relations is the process of dealing with employees when they're represented by a union. Organizations are going to prefer that employees remain non-union because unions limit management's freedom. There's power in numbers. Although unions have declined over time, this was due to increased standards of living made union membership less important. Going back 50 years, people had a much lower standard of living, and unions were able to increase the pay that workers were receiving and increase the safety and also the benefits associated with jobs. Manufacturing jobs are a common industry where you have unionized labor. And as we know, a lot of manufacturing jobs have gone overseas, which has caused union membership to decline. And the globalization of business has caused those jobs to go overseas. So when we manage labor relations, we're going to want to avoid unionization if possible, because once your workforce is unionized, you now have to negotiate with the union, which is a lot more powerful than dealing one-to-one with employees. So businesses are not going to become unionized if, as we can see, we have a fair treatment and clear standards for our employees. We provide a complaint and appeal system, and we don't have favoritism. So if we treat our employees well, we pay them adequately, we have decent benefits for them, and we have fair practices and an appeal system, employees aren't going to be seeking out unionization. Now, unionization is not common in every business, every type of business, but it is common in manufacturing, teaching, and also in grocery stores. And with the case you'll be doing, you'll have to look and see Wegmans is one of the few grocery stores that is not unionized, and it's because of the way they treat their employees. The employees have never felt the need to become unionized because they feel they're treated well in the job. So let's talk a little more about labor relations. When we talk about collective bargaining, this is the process of agreeing on a labor contract between management and the workers, which we refer to as labor. The contract governs the working relationship. It contains all the agreements about wages, hours worked, and working conditions, and how management will treat employees. The grievance procedure is the stepwise procedure by how a labor contract is enforced. So a grievance is filed on behalf of an employee by the union when it believes employees have not been treated fairly under the contract. So if management violates the contract, a provision of the contract, that's something that can be grieved. So for instance, I'll give you an example out of our contract. So whatever the class size is determined to be, so in an online class, it's typically 22 students. So if I'm teaching an online class and I have 24 students, that violates the contract. Remember, contracts govern the working relationship between labor and management. The contract stipulates that I should only have a maximum of 22 students in an online class. If I have 24, there's been a violation, and I would file a grievance. Grievance typically goes to your immediate supervisor, and if it is resolved by your supervisor, then we're done. Perhaps those students could be moved out of that class, moved into another section. That typically doesn't happen. If it's not resolved, then it would go to the next step, which is usually to HR. In our contract, HR would be our second step, and they would gather information, listen to both sides, and see if a provision was violated. Now, there's ways we can solve this. It doesn't have to be that those students are taken out of my class, but it might be that I get paid for those extra students. So you would have to agree to whatever what we call the relief or the remedy would be. If it doesn't get resolved through this grievance procedure, we don't come to a resolution, then it would go to arbitration, where we'd have a third party come in and listen to both sides and make a decision. So if you're a manager working with a unionized labor force, you should definitely familiarize yourself with the contract so that you make sure you don't violate any of those provisions, because it does create a lot of problems and it is very time-consuming going through that grievance procedure. If you're an employee covered by a union contract, you should do the same so that you know what your rights are under that contract. Lastly, let's just touch on contingent and temporary workers. Consistently, we've seen an increase in contingent workers. 10% of the U.S. workforce is either contingent or temporary. There's a challenge here if we have contingent workers. We can see this here at the college. We have full-time faculty, which are tenure track. They have full loads, teaching 5 classes a semester at Raritan. And then we have our contingent workers, which are our part-time faculty or our adjuncts. Advantages and disadvantages to using contingent workers. And there's also a balancing act. You don't want to have too many contingent workers because they don't have the same investment in the organization as a full-time worker does. We can see this with a college. If you have too many part-timers, there might be not enough getting done in terms of long-term planning, in terms of assessment. If we see it in a hospital, you might have too many part-time nurses instead of full-time nurses. You can find the organization go into decline because it doesn't have enough full-time workers to do the work that happens kind of behind the scenes. The labor cost savings, that's really why contingent workers are used. It is a savings. Contingent workers are part-time, so they don't get benefits. We've already talked about how much benefits cost, almost 30% of your payroll. And then you have to make a decision, how similarly do you treat your contingent employees in comparison to your permanent full-time employees? Here at the college, we try to give our adjunct faculty the same benefits we have. We certainly treat them the same in terms of how they run their classes and their academic freedom.